I'm standing in the Keynes apartment at King's College, University of Cambridge, with 3 academics who will be hosting an historic conference here in September, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the publication of John Maynard Keynes' book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Keynes studied and was a Fellow of King's. With me are Professors Maurice Obstfeld, Giancarlo Corsetti and David Howarth. Maurice Obstfeld, Maury to his associates, is a professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley, and previously chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. He is well known for his work in international economics. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Giancarlo Corsetti is Professor of Macroeconomics at Cambridge University, a Fellow of Clare College and the Director of the Cambridge Institute for New Economic Thinking. He is an international economist who combined academic work with long-term collaborations with central banks and international institutions. Currently, he is an academic consultant of the Bank of England and Duesenberg Fellow at the European Central Bank. David Howarth is Professor of Law and Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. He was the Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for Cambridge from 2005 to 2010. He served as an electoral commissioner between 2010 and 2018. Welcome.
I'm Maurice Obstfeld.
Giancarlo Corsetti.
And David Howarth.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us in this discussion. Can we go left to right? But first of all, Maurice, the relevance of the economic consequences of the peace to you today?
We are in a very fraught political moment. We see this in Europe with the rise of nationalism. We see this in the US. We see this in other countries around the world. And in fact, 1919, when Keynes wrote, was also a moment when empires in Europe fell, the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and nationalisms were unleashed. Keynes crystallized the economic consequences of the Versailles settlement, but of course these would have a big role in the macroeconomic developments that followed and in the run-up to the Second World War.
So Giancarlo, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I completely agree with the view. And if I may add, as an international economist, all international economists are engaged on a dimension of Keynes that goes beyond this work on foundation of macro unemployment theory and economic policy. And this is basically how to think in theoretical terms, but also in policy relevant terms. The international division of labor, the international multilateralism, the institutions of the global monetary order. So this is, I think, in many ways the right moment to rethink about this book, given that much of the inheritance of the Bretton Woods institutions are now under scrutiny, under attack.
The right moment, David?
I think it is the right moment. It's the right moment politically as well. The importance of the book is not just economic. Keynes doesn't just do economic theory in this book. He takes on sociology, philosophy, even poetry, to come to views and policy recommendations which are crucial, not just for that time, but for the future of liberal politics between the wars, which was just as much under threat then as it is now. And I think the book is an inspiration for us to rethink not just economic theory, but also the relationship between economics and other fields and liberal politics in an era when it's yet again under threat.
Thank you. I'll come back to all three of you in a moment, but let's learn more about Keynes. Keynes wrote this book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, after the end of the First World War. It's hard to imagine an economics book becoming a bestseller, but it did, and not just in Europe, but throughout the world. It is acknowledged to be a brilliant piece of advocacy. It also established his reputation as one of the 20th century's preeminent economists. Keynes had attended the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 as an advisor to the British government while working at the Treasury. It was a role that some of his pacifist friends in the famous Bloomsbury group of intellectuals thought he should not have taken on. While there, he'd worked daily on financing the war effort. He wanted to limit reparations and thought there should be forgiveness for war debt that would benefit Britain in the longer term. The USA, he suggested, should launch a large credit programme to restore Europe to prosperity. His suggestions were not adopted, and he resigned his position in protest in May 1919 before the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June that year. He then spent 2 months in the summer in Cambridge writing the economic consequences of the peace, but it did solicit some criticism as well as much praise. The book galvanised public opinion here and in the USA against the Versailles Treaty, as it was seen to have established a so-called Carthaginian peace. In other words, a brutal peace achieved by completely crushing the enemy, just as Rome had done in the 3 Punic Wars with Carthage, which ended in 146 BC. He went on to write his last and most important work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, published in 1936, which advocated a remedy for economic recession based on government-sponsored fiscal policies to raise demand and employment. Keynes became a leading figure in establishing the Bretton Woods system in 1944, while war was still raging. It set down the rules for monetary relations between independent nation-states across the world, from America to Western Europe to Australia and Japan. While establishing his own reputation as a leading economist, he also helped forge a role for future economists too, as public intellectuals and advocates. The book resonates down the ages, and you can draw parallels today with the challenges facing much of Europe. Keynes chronicled resurgent nationalism in Europe and the breakdown of pre-World War I international economic integration. He also wrote about the fracturing of traditional alliances and the attacks on the multilateral institutions that had supported economic and financial globalization. Maurice, if we turn to you, the talk of nationalism as if it's a new phenomenon, but it's clear that World War I unleashed such feelings and heightened them. Can you explain why that was?
Well, the 19th century was a period in which there was a long peace, but it was really enforced by political structures and economic structures that we would view today as inequitable and somewhat regressive. And World War I, which sent vast numbers of young people out to die in the trenches, unleashed political forces calling for an extension of political voice, for an extension of self-determination of nations. This was something that President Wilson pushed, and moved us to a very new and uncharted territory. The first part of the interwar period was an attempt to restore earlier economic structures, and Keynes was highly critical of that. Of course, it all came crashing down in the Great Depression, leading to not only vast unemployment around the world, but to the types of political pressures that caused World War II.
And so, did those feelings doom the multilateral effort following the Versailles Treaty? Was it always on the cards that something was going to go wrong?
Well, the first strike against that multilateral effort, of course, was when the U.S. refused to enter the League of Nations, turned inward in a way that we see happening again today to some extent. The mechanisms of multilateral cooperation, particular financial collaboration, were not really well developed in the Versailles framework. And that, of course, was a project that Keynes worked intensively on during World War II, helping to lead to the current Bretton Woods institutions, which have been much more successful up until now.
He had insight into the short-term versus the long-term interests, which others didn't. He was, in that sense, people have said he was a visionary.
Yeah, I think he did have incredible vision and perspicacity. And, in particular, his point about the Versailles settlement, that it was very much a short-term search for repayment, motivated in many cases by very short-term political goals, where a longer-term investment in generosity, in reconstruction, would have led to a much more favorable outcome in the global economy. Even in the post-World War II period, there was a lot of debate about how to handle Germany, how to handle Japan. The Marshall Plan itself was not something that was immediately hit upon after the war. It was only when the threat of communism became manifest that the U.S. developed the Marshall Plan. It was not without controversy that the settlement after World War II was more generous, but at the end of the day, I think people were harking back to Keynes's warnings and taking a different path.
Well, Giancarlo, I can see you nodding there. Your thoughts on what Maurice just said?
I subscribe the view completely, and I cannot again think of a better moment to rethink the fundamental question posed by Keynes, which is basically how to live in, not only how to create a settlement, the treaty, end the conflict, but especially how to make sure that there is no, extra punishment lingering there. Going to punish basically constructed enemies, not even those who are responsible for the crime of the war, but really like extending the punishment. In today's terms, we have not only many conflicts in the world, but especially we have a very large level of debt. And that creates imbalances within countries, across countries. And this is one of the big issues that come out of the book.
David, those big issues still relevant today in the global world?
Yes. Another part of this book, though, is about people and about how important the leaders are. So it's not just about structures and numbers and boundaries. The book includes an astonishingly acute description of the leading politicians of the Versailles Conference. Wilson, described by Keynes as a Presbyterian minister, lacking all the skills of diplomacy you need on that kind of level. Clemenceau just wanting to destroy Germany, the Carthaginian peace. This amazing image of Clemenceau in his grey gloves that he never takes off, which is anyone who reads that will never forget that. But also, though not concentrated pen portrait, but the remarks about Lloyd George are quite remarkable. So he describes Lloyd George as a person of astonishing empathy, of the ability to understand someone else's point of view and to persuade them from their point of view. A person more different from our current Prime Minister on all levels than you could possibly imagine. And it was these three people, with the mistakes they made, that created the Versailles Treaty. Lloyd George's big mistake, described from the point of view of an insider in the book, was to call an election which was designed to consolidate his power, which his advisors then started to panic about his ability to win and move to populism. So Lloyd George's opening position in the election was the peace should be a reasonable peace, and was then driven by his allies and by electoral politics to move to a more populist position, calling for the trial of the Kaiser. Actually, the Kaiser was how he pronounced it. It was a populist pronunciation of the German emperor's title. Behind him, there are other forces in the media and in the other parties calling for the Kaiser to be hanged and for a revenge policy to be put into operation. And so you have Lloyd George with these fantastic skills put to the wrong purpose. Wilson with no skills, and Clemenceau only cared about crushing Germany. Those are the short-term political motivations that led to the errors that the others have described.
Well, David, we'll come back to you in a minute, but let's just focus on Keynes as an economist. Giancarlo, how influential was Keynes' economic theories? Did he stand out from the crowd, and how did his views of global economics differ from those of his contemporaries?
Well, there is many ways to answer this question, but in short, Keynes is really the founder of modern macroeconomics. And some would say that in admiration for the way he thought a new theory out of reading the Great Depression. Some would say in disdain and criticism, saying that the theory is wrong. So there is a strong controversy at the birth of our discipline. clearly Keynes showed a unique gift at the time, which is, instead of forcing the interpretation of reality into comfort of existing theories, sort of the audacity, the creativity, to put on new glasses that kept facts in sharper focus. Now, having said so, this is what Keynes is mostly about in the public domain, but there is another Keynes, again, on the international aspect, the multilateralism, the global economic order. Even without the general theory, even without the Treaty of Money, would still be qualifying him as one of the highest status economists. So what I find extraordinary in the book is that all the root elements are there. So one can read the book and sort of see how then he engages into his extraordinary journey, the journey that goes to the contributing to Bretton Woods institutions.
And how novel, I use the word novel, was it then for an economist to think of a global economics?
Global economics, I don't think, is a new concept. Its elements and content may change over time. I think, it's fair to say, it's already been mentioned, that the World War was the end of the age of empires and the beginning of the age of nation states. What is nice about the book is that Keynes engages in this incredible exercise in creating scenarios, in vision of the new world in ways that recognizes the novelty, just project himself into this forward-looking thinking that is absolutely fantastic. Of course, there are differences, right? Again, we want to see, with the conference, we want to sort of see reality today in the mirror of the book, and this exercise will bring up differences, but we look forward to our contributors to find out more, to discuss more about that.
My curiosity is of Keynes as a man. We know that his contemporaries in the Bloomsbury group weren't fans of his working in government during the war and his contribution to economics from the Foreign Office. But how did his practical experience and his theoretical experience combine? Was it the fact that he had that practical experience that gave him these special insights?
Well, this is a deep question, and I think it's a deep lesson for all social scientists. The fact that a deep engagement, social and political questions is actually key to our intellectual life. And this relation is two-way. We would like to understand the relevant questions, but we can contribute to ask the relevant questions. We can refine and define, and Keynes was a master at this. I really think that this is an important aspect of Keynes' activity. And another thing I would like to say, we live in a world where we make a career as scientists, not only social scientists, also scientists, progressively focus on narrow questions, on specialized questions. Which is great, nothing wrong about being focused. The danger is that it's a balkanization of thinking that sort of creates missed opportunities. There is much to be learned by talking to each other, and this we do not do. The dialogue that Keynes has with himself in the book, drawing on sociology, politics, history, economics, is extraordinary. I think it's really like a masterpiece in showing that it's good to think about your own special question, but it's also it may be extraordinary to engage, to rise a little bit above that and engage across boundaries of disciplines.
Yeah, it's that cross-disciplinary approach. Maurice, you've heard what Giancarlo has just said, but a big turning point for the Western world was the 2008-09 financial crash. People then started saying, well, we need to go back to Keynesian economics. I'm not sure people really understood what it was. People were calling for economists to go back to. What were the wisdoms that Keynes would have brought to that debate about the financial crash, why it happened, and importantly, how to climb out of it?
Well, Keynes was the pioneer of thinking about what he called the liquidity trap, the situation in which nominal interest rates, policy interest rates are zero and can't be reduced much further. And part of his recommendation was for fiscal policy as a response to slumps, even if that meant deficit financing. I would say in the mid-2000s, most mainstream economists viewed this set of theories as perhaps relevant to the pathological case of Japan, but not really relevant in the other advanced countries, certainly not in the more highly inflationary developing world. And suddenly, after the crash, we found ourselves exactly in that world of Keynes's writings. So there certainly was a fiscal response to the crash, but also a lot of innovation by central banks in trying to find ways to conduct monetary policy, despite being in this Keynesian liquidity trap. It would be very interesting to know what Keynes would have thought about all these stratagems that were adopted, because they had many effects, some clearly beneficial for preventing deflation, but also big effects on the distribution of wealth. And I think some of those effects are haunting us today, and Keynes would have had a lot to say about the politics of that.
Giancarlo, clearly you will agree with that, because Keynes would have contributed to that debate. But wisdoms that Keynes could have brought to the 08-09 financial crash solutions, and also what you personally as an economist have taken from Keynes' work and how you've applied it.
I think 2008, 2009, Keynes was an innovative thinker, not out of simply development of discipline, but really out of an engagement with what reality was trying to tell us. 2008, 2009 is another big crisis, so complain about economics, I believe we'll find a forward solution, or we'll go ahead. People will go ahead in economics by responding to the crisis. So the same way in which Keynes taught macroeconomics in 1930, in the 30s, we are now facing a similar challenge to rethink what we are doing in light of 2008, 2009, and a crisis that has not really abated yet. So we still have like a long way to go. There are differences, and we think to digest those differences and understand better. Let me give you a couple of examples. We now understand that it's not only the size of the deficit, the size of the macroeconomic stance that is important, but more important, we are concerned with the content of the way we spend. We come out of many years in which public sector has been downsized. We now understand that the state of public infrastructure, the lack of compensation of the loser from globalization, the fact that the monopoly power, which is market distortion, is so high, all calls for a rethink in the strategy. This is underdeveloped in a way in Keynes' view. Those are the challenges that we need to think creatively, a way to address those today.
And David, I think as a public policy commentator and maker, you would have something to say in reply to our two economists, because they haven't quite given you the solution and the eureka moment to correct these global and regional imbalances in economies. What do you take from the lessons of the 08-09 crash? Is Keynes's work as relevant as ever?
Well, I think the problem's a different problem, but Keynes' approach to the problems he faced was to think about them in historical terms and not just in theoretical terms. In fact, it's quite interesting to see some economists claim to be Keynesians, but go to a theory of what to do, which would be inflationary, and they need to read the economic consequences to see what the problem with inflation is. But more than that, I think if you read the start of the economic consequences, the description of the pre-war situation, you have Keynes there talking about capitalism working because of inequality, that inequality was what drove it, but what kept it together was what people did with the wealth that they accumulated, which was to save it and to produce capital, which was then accumulated at a very high rate, and then could be used for all sorts of different purposes. And I think Keynes would be thinking not just about these technical matters, he would be thinking about the origins of the crisis in the way the system worked before the crisis, in the driving of inequality by the financial markets, which is different from what produced the problems of Keynes' own era, but also what people who gained that wealth did with it. Because Keynes saw, this is a sociological thought, this is a thought from Max Weber, as much as Keynes himself, that what people did with the wealth kind of justified their gathering of it. And
trickle down.
Yes, but also just the effect on everyone else of doing the right thing. What people were doing in the 90s and the 2000s wasn't that. Their behaviour might well have affected the policy choices that people thought they had after it, and has affected how people see, in general, what was done. Because although technically the bailing out of the banks might have been necessary, I was in the Commons when we did it, and we were persuaded that was the only thing to do because otherwise it would be a disaster. The political effects of doing that are quite serious, and I think Keynes would have seen that in a way that perhaps more technical economists these days don't.
Well, let's take a break now at the end of part 1, and please join us again in part 2 when we'll be discussing Keynes' Brexit and Keynes and a Cézanne painting.